Words gushed out of his mouth as he paced his room feverishly, dictating what would become his bestseller, From Death Camp to Existentialism, published in English as Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote, "Now and then I see it still, I collapsed into a chair, weeping. He hadn't got over his slow dying." This was a book that was read in the refectory of a Trappist order, while a professor of philosophy gave his students this assignment: what would Socrates and Frankl have discussed if they had shared the same prison cell? It was an essay I gave to my own students last week. During the course of his life, Frankl met presidents, Eisenhower, prime ministers and popes. Pope Paul VI acknowledged the significance of logotherapy for the Catholic Church, and for all the world, commending Frankl for his conduct in the camps, as well as famous philosophers such as Heidegger, Marcel and Jaspers. Frankl recounts the story told to him by the president of the Alfred Adler Institute of a young Israeli soldier who had lost both legs in the Yom Kippur War. It wasn't possible to get him over his depression, and he was contemplating suicide. Then one day the president of the institute found the man changed. "What happened?" he asked him. He replied, "I've just read Man's Search for Meaning." Frankl calls this autobibliotherapy, healing through reading. So a practical point: why don't we not only introduce philosophy into our secondary schools, but make Man's Search for Meaning required reading in transition years, so that angst-ridden adolescents who are desperately seeking answers to their existential questions might have and hear some answers. At 17, a teenager called Jerry Long wrote to Frankl after a paralyzing diving accident which had left him quadriplegic, "I broke my neck, but it didn't break me." Frankl wrote to him, "What magnificent hour may still await you." Frankl recounts the story when he received a phone call at 3 a.m. from a woman in distress who had decided to end her own life and was curious about what Dr. Frankl would say. He set out all the arguments and they discussed the pros and cons, then finally reached the point where she promised to postpone her plans and come to see him the following morning at 9. He asked her, "What helped you not commit suicide?" And she said, "If anything helped me, it was this. Here I disturb a man's sleep in the middle of the night, and instead of getting angry, he listened patiently to me for half an hour, and I thought to myself, if this can happen, then it may be worthwhile to hang on a little more." In this case, it was the human response rather than any logotherapeutic technique that helped her. The lesson Frankl learned from Freud and Adler was simply to listen to what his patients were telling him. He believed it was never too late to seek help. When he worked with a depressed woman who had been in hospital for a few days, he asked her if she still had any ideas about committing suicide. If the woman said no, he asked 2 more questions. He wanted to make sure she had really changed her mind and wasn't just saying no just to be discharged from hospital in order to go and kill herself. So he asked her why she no longer felt she wanted to commit suicide. If she gave him reasons such as wanting to live for her children, needing to for religious beliefs, wanting to complete a project, Frankl knew she was on the road to recovery. If she answered with an embarrassed silence, then he knew that she had still not decided that her life was worth living. One story worth telling about Viktor and his first wife Tilly. He remarried after the war. They'd been dating for a while when Tilly came to Frankl's apartment to cook for him and his parents, and he received a phone call from the Rothschild, and he got into a taxi that was forbidden for Jews at the time and saved this woman from committing suicide. And when he went back to the apartment, she was still there, and Tilly said, Tilly asked him about the plight of the patient and didn't give out to him, and he said it was then that he determined to marry her on the spot. Our aim is to rise above the situation, the sufferings of the moment, through self-transcendence. Frankl found that survival depended on a person's inner strength, on their ability to use a traumatic or terrible trauma and turn it into a triumph, to face their fate without flinching. There was a strict moral code in the camps against trying to save a man in the process of committing suicide. Yet many times Viktor spoke to someone who was considering killing himself. His approach was always to help him find meaning, something to live for, something that only that person could be or do. Once he addressed a whole group in the camp. He spoke to them for an hour about their future, about their loved ones, about what life still expected from them. And when he finished, there were tears in the men's eyes. He quoted Nietzsche, "He who has a why to live for can cope with almost any how." After the war, he tried to rebuild his broken life. He was still himself contemplating suicide, but decided to wait till his book was finished. He wrote beyond that, "I didn't want to exist." Everything had been taken from him, except one thing, which he calls the last of the human freedoms, and that's the attitude inside his own mind. So he adopted this affirmative attitude in the midst of his own melancholia and tedium vitae. When people came to Frankl saying, "I want to commit suicide," he asked one question: "Why don't you? What is it that's stopping you? Give me a reason." Freedom and responsibility constitute man as spiritual being. The most radical form of the flight from responsibility is flight from life itself in suicide. But even then, man cannot escape his responsibility. Frankl writes, "For he commits the act of suicide in freedom, he cannot escape what he is fleeing from. His responsibility will not let him go, and what he is seeking he will not find, namely the solution to a problem." End of quote. A man who chooses suicide, Frankl writes, is violating the rules of the game of life. The rules of the game do not require us to win at all costs, but they do demand we never give up the fight. Does suicide take courage or cowardice? Is not easy to answer. We must take into account the inner turmoil that normally precedes an attempted suicide. Some loss, the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a job, or the loss of a once loving friendship. Some betrayal or horrendous hurt that leaves a hole in the heart of being. Frankl writes in a footnote, "The suicide person braves death, but funks life." So Frankl exhorts us to revere life in all its horrors and heartaches. Life has unconditional value. The aim is to actualize all our potentialities. The task is unique for each of us and changes from minute to minute. To those who say their life is hopeless, Frankl says, "But what is hopeless? Man cannot predict his future. We don't have the gift of prophecy, and we can't work out in advance what, as I said earlier, magnificent hour may still await us." To give an example, an African-American, but I'm not sure what his race has to do with it, a criminal condemned to a life sentence of forced labour was shipped out to Devil's Island. On the high seas, a fire broke out in the steamer. The convict was released from his handcuffs and saved the lives of 10 people. The sentence was later commuted for this act of heroism. To those who say that man is evil through and through, like the Psalms, "See how the wicked prosper," the model and inspiration of a few ethical geniuses may provide enough justification for humanity as a whole. There is only therefore the meaning of the moment. Frankl holds out the hope that there is super meaning. This is the religious register of being, where one falls in love with an otherworldly source of ultimate attraction. Life transcends itself not in length but in breadth, in height. Life is about depth, not duration. Destiny and death are both essential to its meaning. Real freedom is freedom in the face of destiny. Man's freedom is restricted. There are biological and psychological determinants. Man's reality is a potentiality. We have this liberty to be or not to be that distinguishes us from all other beings and stands in marked contrast with the mode of beings of animals. Fatalism says don't bother, but Frankl says it is never too soon or too late. It is always high time. It is to disregard this is like the alcoholic who is urged to quit drinking. "It is already too late," he replied. "But it is never too late," he was told. "In that case," he said, "I can quit some other time." To view the world sub specie eternitatis, as if under the auspice of eternity, is to give it a cosmic consciousness. It puts perspective on our problems. We see life from a different angle, from the eye of the eagle. A lack of success, for example, doesn't always signify lack of meaning. Life can reach nobility even as it flounders on the rocks. Schopenhauer said that life vacillates between boredom and suffering, and Frankl named boredom as one of the major symptoms of what he called the existential vacuum, this void, this inner void of emptiness and ennui, of apathy, acedia, meaninglessness. In our effort to exist, we push